What's up guys, welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. Now if you've been watching my channel since the start, you'll remember that the first videos I ever made were about Wavy and Glossy. And now, almost a year after I posted those videos, I'm finally going to be revisiting that topic in a little bit more detail. So before I get into this video, if you don't know what Wavy and Glossy are, or how to tell the differences between those prints and that kind of thing, that's not what this video is going to be for. And I would recommend, if you're looking for that kind of information, that you check out the older videos that I already posted on the topic. And I'll put a link to those videos in the description of this video. But in this video, I'm actually going to be going right back to basics and assessing what the relationship between Wavy and Glossy is, really in all senses, and giving an idea of why the two prints exist and how fundamentally they relate to each other. Now, the most fundamental thing that pretty much everyone knows about Wavy and Glossy is that the cards have different textures. So Wavy cards have vertical ripples on the card, and Glossy print cards have that high gloss surface. But the truth is that the differences between the two prints go much deeper than that, and they're actually machined in fundamentally different ways. So Wavy print cards are printed on what's called a sticker stock, which means that there is a foil layer which involves plastic applied to the front of the card, essentially like a sticker. Whereas Glossy print cards are what you could refer to as a paper stock, because even though there is a layer of holographic foil in the card, there's no plastic to that layer, so it's extremely thin, and it essentially just forms part of the paper layer of the card. Now for that reason, Glossy print cards are much more fragile, and for example, you could rip a Glossy print card in half if you wanted to. Whereas with Wavy, because of that plastic layer, you actually wouldn't be able to do that. And furthermore, because Glossy print cards do not have that plastic layer inside them, they're much lighter than Wavy print hollows, relatively speaking. And that is actually the reason why you cannot scale a Glossy print booster pack, whereas Wavy print packs scale out pretty well because the foil layer uses that conventional technology that means that the foil cards weigh more than the common cards. Now, as well as their cardstocks being produced using different methods, Wavy and Glossy were also printed on different printers. And the easiest way to tell this is by looking at print defects, because cards produced on the same printers will also show the same kinds of defects as each other. Now with Wavy, the most well-recognized print defect that Wavy cards have is fading, which is when the magenta ink cartridge runs low in the printer, and so as a result, that color strip is missing to some extent from the card. This Flame Swordsman here is a pretty extreme example of it, but you get it in pretty much all shades. Now Glossy cards do not show this same error, but they do actually show other errors, the most famous of which is probably the foil line error. So if you look at this Cursive Dragon here, you'll see that there's a vertical line running right down the foil. You can also, on much rarer occasions, get horizontal lines as well. But this is a defect which is not found on any kind of Wavy print card. And the other thing to mention is that, unlike Wavy print, Glossy print cards have quite a few issues with the foil placement, so you don't normally get big foil shifts, but you get a lot of very small shifts on the cards. So for example, this trap hole is slightly shifted to the right, so you can see that there's a little bit of foil missing from the left of the card, and a little bit extra on the right hand side. So these two defects both show that Glossy print cards are not produced on the same printers as Wavy print cards, which is an important thing to note. And it's kind of a natural consequence of saying that Glossy cards are produced on different printers that you also have to say they're produced in different facilities, because the kind of facilities where trading card games are produced are highly professional and uniform, and they'll always feature the same brand of printer across the entire facility. But we do actually have other evidence that shows that Wavy and Glossy cards were likely produced in different places. So the best evidence I can give is that some Glossy print commons from the starter decks were actually misfed into the wrong cutting machine and stamped as Bionicle Enter the Bow trading cards instead, and inserted into those packs. Now that Bionicle TCG is another game which was produced by Upper Deck in 2002, so it shows that the facility where Glossy print cards were produced was also where other Upper Deck cards were produced as well. But for Wavy and the related prints to Wavy, we don't have any evidence of that happening, and in addition, the two facilities seem to have had different kind of security measures because with Glossy you get a lot of uncut sheets and other things that weren't meant to leave the factory making their way out. Whereas with Wavy, we have nothing like that at all. And the last thing to mention about being sure that there are two different facilities involved is actually to do with the box designs of LOB. So a lot of people in the past have talked about the fact that glossy print boxes have a larger first edition font than wavy print boxes. And they've often said as a result that it seems likely that Glossy would come before Wavy, because that would explain why the Wavy boxes look like, for example, Metal Raiders boxes in later sets, whereas the Glossy boxes have their own design that's not found elsewhere. But the reason for this is actually to be found elsewhere. So when you look at a box design, the actual base design of that box is just the artwork, without any logos or first edition stamp or anything like that. The reason for that is that logos and first edition stamps can change, they can be removed, or there are various things that you might want to modify about that. So for the base design of the box, you don't have any of that. And then when you actually come to printing the box each time, you'll add those onto the print template during the setup of the run. So the reason that glossy boxes have a different design to wavy is that those two calibrations were done separately. So in the wavy print facility, that meant that it was a smaller font, and in the glossy print facility, that meant that it was a larger font. And another way to confirm that this is the case is that when you look at the box designs in detail, obviously the first thing that jumps out to you is that the first edition font is smaller on the wavy box. But when you look closely, you can actually see that every single piece of text and every single logo that's added to the box is actually in a slightly different location between the two boxes. So for example, the Square Konami logo is slightly further to the left on the glossy box, and even the little bits of text at the bottom about how many cards per pack and that kind of thing, the font, the size, and the placement are ever so slightly different. So it shows that the two different designs for the boxes are actually entirely accidental. They're not a result of any kind of intentional switch from one to the other. They're simply coexisting designs that came about as a result of the printers being set up in two different places. Now, taking a step back for a second, what all of this means is that wavy and glossy should actually be looked at as two completely separate timelines when you're trying to assess things about what came first. And so before I do any kind of comparing between wavy and glossy, what I'm first going to do is try and lay out the individual timelines as accurately as I can. Now, wavy is the much easier timeline to reconstruct, so that's the one I'll target first. Now, wavy consists of 3 different prints, and there are ways to verify this. So the first printing of wavy was the first edition run, which was just for LOB, and in terms of the cards which were meant to be released, it was just the hobby run. They did print retail secrets as well, but they never inserted them into any boxes. Now, the way we can tell that wavy first edition LOB is a separate print to wavy unlimited LOB is primarily by the common card Trial of Hell, because for the first edition run, every single card is titled Trial of Hell, but for the wavy unlimited run, every single card is titled Trial of Nightmare. So this shows that there's no overlap between the wavy first edition and the wavy unlimited runs. They're 2 separate printings. But moreover, we can actually see that the starter decks, which were produced in wavy print as well, are a 3rd separate printing. The best way to show this is that whereas wavy unlimited LOB is printed on the exact same cardstock as wavy first edition and features all of the same print defects such as the lowered title, other misaligned text like with the set code and the serial number at the bottom, and a few other things like that, the wavy unlimited starter decks don't actually feature any of those issues. So the names are centered just as they should be, and the serial numbers as well. And on top of that, there are some variations with the cardstock for wavy unlimited starter decks. So the only example I have at the moment is this wavy unlimited starter deck Yu-Gi Dark Magician. Now you can see this is a wavy print, but the cardstock used on the back, I don't know how well you can see it on the video, but it has an unusual texture going left to right, and this is a different cardstock to what is used on the whole of the run for wavy LOB. And so it shows that they were starting to modify the cardstock a little bit by the time the wavy starter decks were produced, and they're not printed alongside either of the wavy LOB runs. Moving beyond Wavy print. The next print that happened on this timeline would be what's commonly referred to now as 1.5. So this trap hole here is a Wavy Unlimited trap hole. You can see those vertical ripples. But the trap hole to the left of it is what's commonly referred to as a 1.5 print. And the reason this print has this name is that although the actual front stock and the ink used to print the card is exactly the same as a Wavy print card, it no longer features that vertical texture. And the reason for this is that the back of the card is actually printed on a completely different cardstock to any Wavy print cards. So Wavy print cards have a very kind of waxy back surface, whereas 1.5 print cards have this rough surface. And this is actually the same backstock that was used for Metal Raiders cards later. So it's a very convenient way of being able to place 1.5 print right between Wavy and Metal Raiders. And the final print that would happen on this timeline, or not the final print, but the final print that we're going to talk about would be the actual Metal Raiders first edition run, which is demonstrably still on the same printers and still features the same print defects like fading and all of that kind of stuff. But that actually features a new front stock as well as the back stock from 1.5 print. So if I just draw that out quickly on a little timeline, so we can call this side Wavy. So you start with first LOB, then there is a cutoff point, and then you have unlimited LOB, and then another cutoff point, then you have the unlimited starter decks, then another cutoff point, you have 1.5 print, which is both LOB and the starter decks, and then finally you have MRD, and so on. Now in terms of trying to give dates for when all these things were printed, it's not easy, but there are a few things we can say. So Metal Raiders was released June 26, 2002. When you're looking at the time frame that you need to print an entire first edition run for a set and get it sent out to distributors and then sent from distributors onto individual retailers and hobby stores, that means that the printing for Metal Raiders could not possibly have started later than around the end of March or maybe the beginning of April 2002. But if that's being printed at this time, and then you've got 1.5 print before that, and then the 3 separate variants of Wavy print before that, then when you're working your way back through these prints, each of which has to take at least a few weeks, then Wavy first edition LOB would have a latest production date in terms of when it started being produced of Feb 2002. Alright, so that does it for the Wavy timeline. Now we're going to move on to trying to discuss the Glossy timeline. As with Wavy, Glossy consists of multiple prints. So you have the first edition run of Glossy print LOB. You also have an unlimited run of Glossy LOB. And then the same for the starter decks, you have a first edition run and an unlimited run for those as well. But it does actually get a little bit more complex than that with Glossy, because for the first edition starter decks, and this is something that still isn't commonly recognized by collectors, but for those first edition decks, you actually have 2 different cardstocks being used. So the more commonly recognized one is the regular Glossy print stock, which is this Start Magician on the right here. So this has the same high gloss finish that you expect from a Glossy print card. But with the starter decks, you actually get a separate print run, which did not feature any gloss on the surface, almost at all. So this Start Magician here is an example of that. You should be able to see, if we zoom up close, that the surface really doesn't feature any kind of gloss, and instead it has a strange kind of lumpy texture, which has a horizontal pattern to it as well. Now these have a much more fragile surface than the regular Glossy print cards because there's nothing protecting the front, so you often get little flecks coming off from the card. So that's one important thing to note about the starter decks in Glossy print. And it's important as well to say that even for the regular starter deck cards which do have gloss, the printing isn't identical to LOB. There are a few differences in terms of foil alignment and also foil bleed, which is found a lot more on the starter decks than for LOB, which shows that these are not simultaneously produced, so one has to have come before the other. In terms of saying which one came before which, that's a more complicated topic that I'll get into now. People have always assumed historically that Legend of Blue Eyes was printed before the starter decks, for the simple reason that they were released 3 weeks earlier. And so if you're releasing a product 3 weeks earlier, then it makes sense that you'd also print it beforehand. But recently there's been some speculation that it may have actually been the other way around. That's what I'm going to assess now. So the biggest piece of evidence presented is that if you look at the UPCs, or unique product codes, for the earliest Yu-Gi-Oh products, you arrange them by number. All of the earliest numbers are actually the starter decks, and then LOB comes after that. So some people have used this to say that that's a sign that starter decks would have actually been printed before LOB, and that's why the numbers are that way around. Now, in terms of whether that argument holds, I would say you have to be very cautious about it, because if you look at the list also puts unlimited LOB before first edition LOB, which we know cannot possibly have been the printing order that was actually happened in practice. And on top of that, all of the numbers in the list are one after the other, which means that all of those unique product codes were filed at exactly the same time. If there was any gap between them at all, then there would be other products, just from completely unrelated things inserted between them, and they wouldn't be consecutive numbers. So, in terms of that being strong evidence for the starter decks coming first, I would say it's actually pretty weak. Now, another thing which people mention, which I don't think is very relevant to this argument, is to do with sample cards. So people say that the sample cards produced from the starter decks are glossy, and the fact that they come from the starter decks, not from LOB, means that those must have been the first cards that they were printing. But there's a few things which are mistaken about this argument. So when people hear the word sample, what they naturally think of is some kind of prototype card, some kind of card that is produced before the others. And with the starter deck samples, that is true of only one card, which is the Unlimited Summon Skull. Now that card was produced in Japan and then shipped over by Konami to North America to show to different stores as an example of what the card game would look like. And when you look at that card in detail, unfortunately I don't have an example with me on hand anymore. It has some pretty noticeable differences compared to a first edition starter deck Yu-Gi card as it was released in the deck. So the most obvious one is that the text on the sample card actually only reaches 2 lines, whereas the font is slightly more italicized and slightly larger on the actual cards that end up being printed, and so it takes 3 lines instead of 2. So that sample card is in a sense a prototype card. I think it would be fair to call it that, but that card is not glossy. It's actually on OCG cardstock, so it doesn't really tell you anything about whether the starter decks were produced first in glossy. The other sample cards produced are first edition glossy print, and those exist for pretty much every other common from the deck than Summon Skull. But the problem with those is that they're not actually prototype cards, as some people have speculated in the past. All the evidence that we have about those cards suggests that those are actually complete decks of commons that were handed out to judges and upper deck officials right around the release of the game to show kids how to play. And that's why they have sample on the back, because they're not distributed in actual decks, and they may also have been shown to kids even in the first 3 weeks before the starter decks were released, as well as in Europe, where the game wasn't released until many months later. So we can say with relative confidence that those cards were not released substantially before the first edition run of starter deck Yu-Gi hit the shelves. And another pretty good piece of evidence to show that is that Upper Deck was not actually announced as the official distributor of the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG in North America until February 11th, 2002. So whereas it is possible that they were already printing cards in preparation for that announcement before that date, it's impossible that any cards would have left that facility before the contract had been signed. So those are the arguments that people have used so far to say that the starter decks came before LOB, and as I just discussed, I don't actually think they're very strong evidence at all. But there is actually a much more interesting piece of evidence that I've been able to dig up, which definitely suggests that it's a possibility. And the evidence for that is that if we look at the uncut sheets we have for Glossy, We only have LOB uncut sheets, both first edition and unlimited. And at the bottom of all of those sheets, there's a bit of auto-generated text by the printer, which says O2 Yu-Gi-Oh! Boosters. And we don't have any starter deck sheets uncut, but there are some miscuts from the glossy print starter decks where the printer completely misaligned, the cutter rather, completely misaligned where it was cutting the cards. And as a result, we have some miscuts right from the bottom of one sheet, and the text auto-generated by the printer on that sheet says O1 Yu-Gi-Oh! Starter decks. So what that means is that the printers which were used to print glossy cards were first set up for starter decks before they were set up for Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. Now that's a very interesting point, but I should point out that that doesn't necessarily mean that the actual official runs of the starter decks were made before LOB. And the reason for that is that the starter decks are a smaller print than LOB, and so it makes sense that they would use those templates, they would set them up first. It's only two different sheets, the commons and the hollows, that they would use those to actually test the printer settings and potentially make prototype prints and things like that, which weren't allowed to leave the factory. Whereas LOB is a much more complicated run because you'd have to have one sheet for the commons, one sheet for the short prints, another sheet for the rares, another sheet for the super rares and the ultra rares, and then finally another sheet for the secrets. So that is a much more time-consuming run, and especially in terms of testing settings, it's much less appropriate. So it does appear that the starter decks would be the first cards which were printed in a sense, but whether that's the official run is still another question, and I'm going to go into that in more detail now. In terms of reasons to be hesitant about the starter decks being printed before LOB, there's a few things to say. So the first thing is that we know that the glossy run of LOB was extremely last minute, going by the date of Feb the 11th that we have on the uncut sheets. Because the set was released on March the 8th, it was shipped from distributors on March the 1st. And so the fact that the run was still even going 3 weeks before release is actually surprising, because normally with these kind of things you'd expect that that run was finished by really the end of 2001, but absolute latest Jan 2002. So if they were that squeezed for time already, it's very unusual that they would choose to print the starter decks in their entirety before LOB and give themselves even less time to print LOB. Now looking at the cards, there's also a few reasons to think that LOB predates the starter decks. The first reason is that LOB first edition, both Wavy and Glossy, is the only print in the entire game to feature a foil alignment mark. So if you look at this bottom left corner, you'll see that there's a little light strip here, which isn't part of the artwork that's been inserted onto the card. And the reason it's there is to help the printer align the foil correctly when it's printing the foil onto the card. Whereas for the starter decks, and with all later prints of Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's no mark in the bottom left corner because they obviously decided that it wasn't actually necessary for the cards. So that's another thing to consider if you're thinking about which one came first between the starters and LOB. And the final thing is going back to those Bionicle miscuts that I talked about earlier. So the Bionicle Enter the Bow-Rock TCG was released, it was just a brief promotional thing by Upper Deck in conjunction with McDonald's, and it came out on May the 24th, 2002. So if you're going to try and say that the starter decks were made substantially before Feb the 11th, 2002, which would have to be the case for them to predate LOB, it would be quite unusual that they were made alongside this Bionicle TCG, which was coming out so much later. And if you were just using the normal time frames to work out when that Bionicle game was printed, then you would expect that to be somewhere around Feb to March 2002, based on the release date and the time frame it was released for. So bringing back this little piece of paper, we're now going to attempt to draw out the other side of it, which is the Glossy Timeline. Now, what we have to say for this is that there are some different options which could be the case. Now, the most likely thing for the beginning of it would be that the LOB first edition run is the first official run in terms of cards which were actually inserted into products. And the reason for that, not only the stuff I've just mentioned, but also the fact that the presentation sheets for LOB, which were leaked from the factory, those coincide with the same day that Upper Deck officially signed their contract with Konami for the TCG. And so it is very likely that those were the official first cards produced, which were on those sheets. So for that reason, I would say most likely LOB first edition is the first glossy printing. But there is also the possibility that it's the starter decks, and we simply don't have enough evidence to say. Now, whichever one of those was first would then be followed by the separate print of the Unlimited, and then the first edition print of the other one. So either that's the starter deck Kaiba first ed, or that's LOB first edition. And then finally, the Unlimited of whichever print that is. So I do think these could be either way round, but based on all of the evidence that we've looked at, it definitely seems more likely that the LOB first edition run was first, and then the Unlimited, and then the starter deck Kaiba first edition, starter deck Yugi first edition, and then the Unlimited for that. And one more reason to think that this is probably the right way around is that the Unlimited run of starter deck Yugi and starter deck Kaiba in glossy print is by far the smallest run of any of the prints on this page. These decks really, based on the numbers still out there, could not have been produced in quantities of more than a few thousand, which is a really tiny print run for such a huge card game that was coming out. And so it does suggest that that was kind of cut off early in some sense. And that makes sense if it's at the end of the run, because there were no more glossy cards produced. There were no more cards produced in whatever facility glossy cards were produced in after this point, because they were all produced in the Wavy facility instead. So now that we finally got this timeline here, the last thing to do is to try and, I guess, draw some conclusions in terms of what came first from one side to the other. And the only easy conclusion that we can draw is that LOB Glossy Unlimited came before LOB Wavy Unlimited. And the reason for that is that Glossy Unlimited is the only print to still feature the name Trial of Hell, whereas Wavy Unlimited features the name Trial of Nightmare, as I showed earlier. So that much is fair to say, but in terms of saying which of the first edition runs came first, I think it's actually highly unlikely that either one could possibly have come before the other in their entirety, and I'll talk about that more now. So when collectors use the term first print, historically they've always meant it as saying that one print would actually be released before the other, so that on release day of March the 8th, either only Wavy cards were available or only glossy cards were available. And that's also the kind of notion which has resulted sometimes in one print being valued higher than the other because it came first. But based on all the evidence we've looked at today, it's pretty clear that neither print could have come before the other in its entirety. So we know that glossy print must have been available at release because it was possible for stores to pre-order both retail and hobby boxes, and Wavy print, although the entire run was made, it was only ever packaged into hobby boxes, and no retail products with Gaia the Dragon Champion were ever released. But similarly on the other side, we have a lot less evidence for Wavy print, but it's pretty clear when you look at the timeline that I reconstructed just now that the production must have begun right around the same time as Glossy. And in addition to that, the fact that Glossy Unlimited LOB exists shows that Wavy first edition must have been made before Glossy stopped being produced. Otherwise, the Glossy Unlimited run simply wouldn't exist because the quota for first edition boxes would not have been met yet if Wavy was still going to be printing more first edition after that. And in addition to that, we do have the anecdotal evidence that it's possible to pull Wavy print cards from misfed or error glossy boxes, which again shows that their production must have been happening at a similar time. So what that means overall, I guess, is that talking about a first print has more or less become redundant at this stage, because any kind of notion of first print which actually would have significance has been disproved. There's no possibility that either print run would have come cleanly before the other or been released before the other. And that's really what historically has interested people about the first print debate. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this video, but before I wrap up, I just want to recap everything I've said in this video and kind of give a few closing remarks about what it means for Wavy and Glossy moving forwards. So if I had to give one moral of this whole story, it would be that first edition really is first print, and we shouldn't try and say anything about Wavy or Glossy coming before the other, because there simply isn't any evidence that that is the case, and moreover there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's not the case. But I hope what I've achieved in this video, as well as showing that there is no first print, is also to try and explain why there is no first print. Because when you break this down into the two separate production lines, as I have done, and show how unrelated the production of Wavy and Glossy cards are from one another, that really takes away a lot of the impetus about even wanting to say whether there was a first print among them, because it becomes clear that there's simply parallel production lines, and therefore that they overlap. And now in terms of why Konami or Upper Deck use these two different production lines, that's more or less just in the realms of speculation, but there's certainly plenty of things which could plausibly be said about it in terms of, for example, perhaps Upper Deck owned specifically the Glossy facility. The other facility appears not to have been owned by Upper Deck based on the fact that it never changed hands even after Upper Deck lost control of the game. And there's countless other possibilities as well that could come into play, but I'm not going to talk about those here because I don't think there's anything too helpful to be gained by that kind of speculation. But what matters at the end of the day is that neither print is any kind of reprint, which I think is the fundamental question that collectors have always been worried about. Now, in terms of whether there should be a difference in the market between Wavy and Glossy cards, that's really a different topic for another video, and I've gone on so long in this video already that I don't really want to make it any longer than I have to. But what I will say is that we should not necessarily assume just because both prints are first print that means they will suddenly have the same values. Because that would only be the case if the only reason that one print had a premium over the other in the past was because people thought it was first print. And I think it's pretty clear when you look at the market these days, it's at a very advanced stage compared to where it used to be, that's simply not a complex enough model to show what people are doing with their money. So some cards like Trihorn Dragon, for example, are rarer in PSA 10 in glossy print, and we've actually seen some sales of that which are potentially higher than the Wavy variant of that card for that reason. Whereas for certain cards in Wavy print, such as Red Eyes Black Dragon, the supply is so much lower than for the glossy variant, and the demand is so much higher because of the aesthetics, that it simply results in a huge price tag. I would say in the current market, you're probably looking at about 100% premium for a PSA 10 Wavy Red Eyes over a glossy. So really the fundamental thing to take away is that just because Wavy isn't first print or glossy isn't first print doesn't mean that suddenly it's all just first edition LOB again, and there won't be a difference in the market prices between the two prints. And that finally brings us to the end of this video. So thank you everybody for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, that's very impressive, and I appreciate all the attention. This will probably be the final video that I ever post on Wavy and Glossy in terms of the first print debate, because at this point I really think I've said about everything there is to say on it. But if you'd like to see other videos on, for example, the market between Wavy and Glossy and other things like that, feel free to put it down in the comments below, as well as any other questions you have, and I'll do my best to get back to everyone. But for now, this is Schloss signing out, and I hope you all have a great day.